This is your tech news briefing for Friday, February 24th. I'm Zoe Thomas for the Wall Street Journal. Today marks 1 year since Russia invaded Ukraine. The war's toll shows on Ukraine's people, its infrastructure, and its once thriving tech sector. Last summer, I spoke to some Ukrainian tech CEOs about how the war had impacted their businesses and what they thought their sector's future was. I caught up with one of them, Oleg Roginsky, CEO and founder of People AI, a few days ago. People AI is based in California, but it had a lot of employees in Ukraine before the war. Many of them have relocated to Prague or Toronto. For those who stayed, the war has created extra challenges.
We obviously have introduced additional security protocols for the few folks who are still in Ukraine, in terms of them being far from the front lines, their systems being secured, and obviously if the security situation changes, we have an ability to remotely kind of lock things down, wipe them, and make sure that the customer data security is preserved at all times. But also, definitely there is impact on employees in terms of rolling blackouts, inability to work in work time, etc. And so we sent in batteries. We are trying to help as much as we can, but there are definitely physical limitations to how Ukraine operates from a business perspective right now.
Tech has defined this war, from the sector it shook up to the tools used to fight it, and the ways it's being captured and shared across the world. In fact, smartphones have made this the most intensely documented war in history. With us to discuss the impact of that is Stephen Fidler, WSJ Bureau Chief at Large in London. Hi, Stephen. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Let's talk about some of the ways smartphones are being used, first by militaries. For armies, are these new tools of war?
They're fairly new. They're being used in several ways to find targets and locate targets, both sort of unwittingly and wittingly, if you like. Unwittingly, the use of smartphones by Russian soldiers on the front has allowed Ukrainian forces to geolocate concentrations of troops and target them. So essentially that's sort of poor battlefield security, if you like, but it has allowed them to do this. And of course, this isn't the first world war in which that has happened. There's also been help by, if you like, partisans or ordinary citizens in occupied territories using smartphones to locate for Ukrainian forces, concentrations of troops and ammunition and that kind of thing. And that's an issue that sort of blurs, if you like, the difference between combatants and civilians in warfare. But it has been something that has been used by the Ukrainians significantly during the war.
Are the Russians using this as well? Are they taking advantage of geolocation technology, for example?
It's hard to say. I suspect that's true. One thing that seems to have happened is that the operational security of the Ukrainians has seemed to be better than that of the Russians. Ukrainian forces seem less likely to be using cell phones at the front or smartphones at the front, less likely to be phoning home and that kind of thing. Of course, it's probably impossible to stop this with an army, but it does seem that the Ukrainians, in terms of security, have been rather better at this than the Russians.
What about the role of social media? Because, that's a big reason we go on to our smartphones.
Absolutely. I think it's been an enormous factor in the war, really. And it helps people, I think, very broadly to understand what's going on in the battlefields in ways that probably weren't widely understood before. They also provide an element for propaganda as well as disseminating facts. A lot of the sort of narrative of the war, if you like, has come through platforms like Facebook, but Facebook is banned in Russia. So there are specific platforms there, one called Vkontakte, which is used in Russia as like Facebook, and another one called Telegram, which is widely used in Russia and in Ukraine. This is a barely curated platform with very kind of little censorship on what goes on. It's not like Twitter and that kind of thing. So there are all kinds of outpourings available on Telegram of atrocities, but other things that, many of which violate the Geneva Conventions. But they have provided an enormous kind of amount of footage and helped create the narrative, the widely understood narrative that we have of the war.
So is this armies, those who are involved in the war, posting on social media, or is this also everyday Ukrainians who might be posting some of these stories as well?
It is both. So it's everyday Ukrainians. Obviously, we see quite a lot from what happens when there are attacks on targets in Kyiv, in the capital. But we're also seeing stuff from the front lines. I suspect that's more, shall we say, curated by the Ukrainian military authorities. So they get a narrative out. And the same is true of the Russians. But again, I think the Russians have probably been less disciplined in this. And we see quite often elements that come from the Russian side that are probably not conducive or not very helpful to the Russians in the conduct of the war. But yeah, both civilians and soldiers.
You mentioned smartphones and social media being used to potentially document war crimes. A few months ago on the show, we had a conversation about smartphones being used in this way in Ukraine. But one issue has been just the amount of data that's being collected by so many smartphones on the battlefield. How are the groups who are getting this information dealing with that overwhelming amount of data coming in?
You're absolutely right. That's a huge issue for them. One of the groups that I've talked to, it's called Mnemonics, and it's a Berlin-based non-profit that is attempting to document war crimes. And it has a sister organization in Syria. And in Syria, over the course of, say, 11 years, they have about 5 million pieces of recordings and other things, videos of the war, which they have archived. So far, in a year of war in Ukraine, they have 2.8 million. And this is years of footage. For someone to sit down and look at all that would take years. But they're sort of archiving it, giving it a special sort of identity so it can't be subsequently altered. And as well as looking at it manually, they're using technologies like computer vision, sort of artificial intelligence and machine learning to try to identify key elements of the footage. These are things that will develop, will become probably better at the tasks that they're supposed to do. And groups like Mnemonics are hoping that this will allow for a kind of reckoning in possible war crimes tribunals at the end of the war.
All right, that was Stephen Fidler. Thanks for joining us, Stephen.
You're welcome.
And that's it for Tech News Briefing this week. TNB's producer is Julie Chang. Our supervising producer is Melanie Roy, and our executive producer is Chris Sinsley. I'm your host, Zoe Thomas. Thanks for listening, and have a great weekend.